Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. Joining me is James Carden. He is a former State Department advisor, the executive editor of the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, co-founded by the late Stephen F. Cohen, and he writes at thescrum.substack.com. James, making your Pushback debut. Very excited to have you.
Well, thanks for having me, Aaron. Nice to see you.
So let's talk about the Biden-Putin summit, a lot of hype around it. What were your key takeaways from their relatively brief meeting?
Well, my key takeaway is that it could have been worse. There are a number of pretty good things that came out of it. The first thing I guess I'd point to was the overall tone between the two presidents. It wasn't marked by overt hostility, nor kind of slavish deference. I was just on a Zoom conference sponsored by the Quincy Institute, in which former Governor Jerry Brown said that both presidents acted as professionals and as human beings, and that was a significant step forward. And I think Governor Brown is right about that. So there's tone, and then there were some actual, in the parlance of the foreign policy bureaucracy, some deliverables that came out of it. The first and probably most important was the announcement of a bilateral strategic stability dialogue. Both presidents said there was an agreement to begin negotiations around issues of cyber. Both presidents repeated the pledge that President Reagan and President Gorbachev made in 1985 at Geneva, in which they declared that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And finally, both sides agreed to send back their ambassadors. Both ambassadors had been recalled to their respective capitals since the springtime. So, that's the positive side of the ledger. And so I think, for the most part, not bad.
What are the key issues where it will require some courage, some actual courage and some spending of political capital by Joe Biden to overcome the hawks that dominate the DC foreign policy establishment? He already took one step in that direction when he overruled people like Tony Blinken and Victoria Nuland in his own State Department in dropping these Trump sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which was an attempt to thwart the completion of this key pipeline between Russia and Germany. But so what is next? What will be Biden's next test when it comes to actually improving relations with Russia and showing some political spine to bring that about?
Right. Well, I think, in a way, he showed plenty of spine yesterday, in not only, as you say, probably overruling his more hawkish advisors like Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland and Wendy Sherman and Antony Blinken. But I think that, if he's going to spend a lot of political capital on Russia, which I don't necessarily think he will, but if he did choose to do so, you have to address the underlying issue between the two countries. And the underlying issue in Europe is really NATO expansion. And if we're going to get to an even better place with Russia, we have to recognize that NATO expansion and pledges to bring in Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance are really at the root of a lot of the problems that we've been having. I don't expect Joe Biden to do that, but we're eventually going to have to come to that point. Eventually, we're going to have to reach out to the Russians and begin negotiations over a kind of grand settlement with regard to Ukraine. And I think it's very straightforward. We pledge not to bring Ukraine or Georgia into the alliance, and they get out of the Donbas region in Ukraine, which they really don't want to be in the first place. I know people don't believe that, but that is the case. and so you have the makings of a grand bargain there. But I don't expect that to occur under a Biden administration, though. Who knows? No one expected Ronald Reagan to end the Cold War, so we may be surprised.
Well, I don't want to get into history, but couldn't you argue that the Cold War would have ended a lot earlier had presidents like Reagan not built up the U.S. Nuclear stockpile, forcing Russia to then build up its own?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, but on the other hand, if you look back through the history of the Cold War, it was Republican presidents who were the ones pursuing a policy of détente, beginning with Eisenhower, continuing through with Nixon, and then to Reagan. The Democrats have always embraced the kind of Truman-Atchison philosophy of taking a very hard line towards the Soviet Union, and that is, unfortunately, that tradition has carried over to our present day, and I think explains a lot of the grotesque hysteria that has marked Democratic discourse with regard to all things involving Putin and Russia.
Yeah, so on this front, you had this recent controversy with the Biden administration so you have him on the one hand appointing people like Tony Blinken, who's a hawk on Russia, Victoria Nuland, instrumental in the disaster that has helped plunge U.S.-Russia relations to a historic low with the Maidan coup in Ukraine in 2014. So so Biden brings in those people. Meanwhile, there was talk that this Russia expert named Matthew Rajansky was going to be considered for a top position on the National Security Council. The hawks in Washington freaked out, and that potential candidacy was voided. He was no longer considered. Can you comment on that and what that says about the Biden administration's overall approach to Russia today?
Yeah, the Rajansky incident was, I think, very, very, very telling. I knew Matt a little bit, and I respect Matt as a scholar and as a person. He's a very decent human being. But the idea that Matt Rajansky is some sort of threat to the foreign policy establishment in Washington is utterly ludicrous. So if someone who has expressed the most mild criticisms of the foreign policy establishment is ruled out of bounds, I'm afraid that it just shows that there's no room for really any sort of dissent in Washington. And I suspect that, the signal has been that was kind of a signal to everyone else who wants a job to kind of get in line and get with the program, because Matt Rajansky is no Steve Cohen. He did not, dissent very forcefully from the establishment line. So anyway, I think that was a warning sent by the blob to the rest of us.
So let me ask you about Syria. It didn't really come up in the news reporting on the summit that I saw, but before Biden departed for the summit, he made this bizarre comment about Syria at a news conference where he confused Libya and Syria like 3 times. And that got a lot of headlines. But aside from that, the implications of that, him confusing Syria and Libya, there was what he actually said about possibly reaching a deal with Russia on Syria. And I saw both maybe a positive sign that he was talking about engaging with Russia on Syria and reaching some sort of settlement on an issue where the U.S. right now is occupying 1/3 of Syria and imposing the harshest sanctions in the world that are preventing Syria from rebuilding. But then he also seemed to suggest, and maybe you have a different take, that the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people, the fact that Syria can't provide for its people fully right now because they're under such dire conditions, is a point of U.S. leverage. So let me play the clip for you and get your response.
Where we could work together with Russia. For example, in Libya, we should be opening up the passes to be able to go through and provide food assistance and economic vital assistance to a population that's in real trouble. I think I'm going to try very much hard to. It is. And by the way, there's places where I shouldn't be starting off and negotiating in public here, but let me say it this way: Russia has engaged in activities which we believe are contrary to international norms, but they have also bitten off some real problems they're going to have trouble chewing on. And for example, the rebuilding of Syria, of Libya, they're there. And as long as they're there without the ability to bring about some order in the region, and you can't do that very well without providing for the basic economic needs of people. So I'm hopeful that we can find an accommodation where we can save the lives of people for example, in Libya.
James Carden, what did you make of this comment?
Hardly enlightening. I think that he was probably confused, as you suggested, between Libya and Syria. So I think he probably meant Libya because it's been reported in recent days that French President Macron is trying to get a multilateral group together to deal with the situation in Libya. I would find it hard to believe that he meant Syria because it would be a non-starter on Capitol Hill, particularly because of some of the legislation that's been aimed at Syria, particularly the Caesar Act that was sponsored by Eliot Engel. I think that would preclude cooperation with Russia in rebuilding Syria. So I suspect that he meant Libya. Always amused when an American president and someone like Joe Biden, who's been in public life for 5 decades, talks about violating international norms. While he seems to have made some progress, in the summit meeting with Putin, old rhetorical habits die hard.
And let me ask you about some of the media coverage. There was so much excitement in the U.S. media about the spectacle of all these reporters confronting Putin, asking about Navalny, confronting Biden, saying to him, like, when are you going to punish Putin for his bad behavior? As if Russia is just some giant child and the U.S. is the parent that disciplines Russia for behavior that it deems to be untoward. But what I found funny about the media aspect of this is that, multiple U.S. European outlets were allowed to ask Biden questions and, hostile questions. They're allowed to ask Putin hostile questions. Whereas Biden didn't take one question from a Russian outlet, except perhaps the U.S. government-funded Russian outlet in Europe, and he spoke for about half the time as Putin did.
Well, Putin is used to these long kind of things, right? Around the end of the year, I think it's around the end of the year every year, he does these kind of marathon call-in shows, and they go on and on and on. And he takes calls from the public and the press. He's used to it, and he's very good on his feet. Joe Biden is older. He's in obvious cognitive decline, and he was really never that good on his feet anyway. The press coverage is interesting. I think you're right. Putin took, I think, 7 questions from American outlets, and Biden took none from the Russian outlets. But that's just kind of superficial. The real kind of problem with the coverage is that the American media outlets seem to be egging Biden on to take a harder line than the president wanted to, which is sort of I guess it's a product of the last several years of Russiagate hysteria, but it also shows that the people who make up the American press really don't know that much about Russia or foreign policy. And, you see this, all the time. You mentioned Navalny, right? So like even a halfway decent outlet like the Financial Times, their headline today, I'm reading off of it, was Biden warns Putin of devastating repercussions if Navalny dies in jail. Okay. I don't really think that Biden meant that if Navalny dies in jail, we're going to launch a nuclear strike. I think what he probably meant was if Navalny dies in jail, Congress and the media is going to go absolutely crazy, and I'm not going to be able to do anything with you. So it's going to tie my hands, and in order to do the things that we said that we're going to do. So that stuff has just become par for the course. It's depressing, but I guess it's not going to change anytime soon.
Well, speaking of depressing, just to illustrate how far to the right U.S. media has gone, let's take an example from a leading progressive outlet. They did an interview on Democracy Now! With Masha Gessen, a Russian-American journalist. And it was just one of the most chauvinist interviews I've ever seen on that show, especially. But to me, it just illustrated the extent to which, our media has been captured by Russiagate, where you have even people at the leading end of the dissenting spectrum going along with it. And Masha Gessen said that it was wrong even to put Vladimir Putin on TV.
Then we spend 10, 15 minutes trying to dissect that propaganda trope and trying to find a kernel of truth in something that is designed to obscure truth is a reason why we shouldn't be putting dictators on national television.
That Biden was going into the summit with the aim of finding areas of cooperation, but not Putin.
Biden is concerned in the sort of standard American idiom with deliverables, with finding areas of common interest, and he is alone in that. He's alone in actually trying to negotiate in good faith.
And she even made a comment that I just thought was so just straight up bigoted about her native country, Russia, where she said that Russians don't value human life.
But I think another reason that they are not taking the vaccine is because of the general sort of culture of a lack of respect for human life, which is also characteristic of this particular government. Under Putin, human life is worthless.
So that's Masha Gessen speaking on Democracy Now! And she's talking about why she thinks there's been a low vaccination rate in Russia, or a relatively low vaccination rate in Russia. She says that it's because Russia doesn't have a respect for human life. And I just thought that the fact that that could pass without challenge on a leading progressive show just illustrates the extent to which Russiagate has normalized Russophobia in the U.S.
Yeah, but you're not really surprised Democracy Now! Let that go, right?
Well, no, I mean, but you'd expect maybe a challenge, at least something.
No, I get it. I mean, Gessen's comment is kind of the worst kind of marriage of pop psychology and neoconservative bloodlust. And that's what characterizes liberal coverage of Russia and has for the past several years. I don't know what, Gessen has had this sort of Putin obsession long before 2016. And, she wrote a book about Putin years ago called Man Without a Face. And, she recounts meeting him, and he actually offered her a job in Russian state media. So I don't know what the grudge is, but you find this a lot in, diaspora communities, right? And the coverage in the United States, the narrative, is shaped in large part by people who have some kind of ideological axe to grind with Russia because they just got here, or their parents or grandparents. And so it's shaped by people who have, for whatever reason, very, very hostile towards it. And so they've been able to kind of hijack the narrative and, frankly, hijack U.S. national security and turn it around and use it to their own ends. I mean, you have people like Julia Yaffe and Max Boot, and Applebaum to an extent is like that. And then you have people who aren't media stars, but who are very wealthy and influential, like the hedge fund manager, William Browder. William Browder is an American trader. He comes from a long line of American traders, beginning with his grandfather, Earl. Browder, renounced his American citizenship for tax purposes. So he's not an American citizen, but his views have been very influential in Congress, and he's managed to turn what is a personal grudge against Vladimir Putin, because Putin hurt his business interests, into this sort of phony human rights crusade. And so, it's a problem. But you find this, with people, in diaspora communities from Cuba, in the United States, they have way too much to say about U.S. policy to Cuba. You see that with these conservatives who have fled Venezuela as well. I know that you guys have covered that.
Yeah, Syria too. It was
Syria is a great example. China.
Yeah.
So they're not unique, but let's call it for what it is, right? I mean, they have their own personal problems with Russia or the Soviet Union, or what happened under Yeltsin, or what happened under Putin, and they are trying to hijack U.S. national security aims for their own self-interest. So I think it's despicable.
And I'm personally right now feeling the absence of Stephen F. Cohen, who we both knew. He was such a prominent voice on U.S.-Russia relations. And whenever there were big media events like this, summits like this, I mean, he was the voice of reason. And what was amazing is that he was able to, air it to a large number of people, because he was just that, his credentials were that impeccable, and his experience, both directly advising the first President Bush, and the fact that he had such a high stature in the academy, professor emeritus at Princeton and NYU, allowed him to break through. And of course, that was marginalized in his last years, when he was so forcefully outspoken on the Maidan coup in Ukraine, on Russia's intervention in Syria to prevent, in the words of John Kerry, ISIS from taking over Syria. And then finally on Russiagate. There was an attempt to minimize him, but still, he reached a lot of people. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that, and your thoughts on how he'd be viewing this moment right now.
Well, of course, he also had a sideline in journalism. He worked for CBS, and he covered the very important summits in 1985 in Geneva between Reagan and Gorbachev, in 1990 in Malta between Bush and Gorbachev. And of course, he was very great friends with Gorbachev. So it's hard not to think of Steve when a U.S.-Russian summit occurs. And I think that for the most part, he would have been probably pleased by the mature tone that that Biden and Putin took with one another, and the small but not insignificant progress that was made.
All right. So as we wrap, going forward, what are you looking towards in terms of U.S.-Russia relations next? What do you think will be the issues that are going to be negotiated, and what do you see as the upcoming potential flashpoints?
The question is, will Biden be undermined by his own bureaucracy? Right. This is something that we saw under the last two presidents, Obama and Trump. That was really obvious under Trump. So, will the small steps that were made towards coming to an understanding or modus vivendi over, cyber warfare, nuclear weapons, strategic stability, even the reinstitution of consular services in both countries, right? Will these very good initiatives be undermined by the hawks that Biden has put in almost every single position? throughout his administration. So I think that's something that we're going to have to watch very closely.
James Carden is a former State Department official, the executive editor for the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, and he writes at thescrum.substack.com. James, thanks a lot.
Aaron, thanks.